Hi, welcome. I posted my two previous videos about this topic on Ogit, and a user called
Szarżujący byk
asked me for more charts about the Cold War. Fun fact, I googled the username and apparently means charging bull in Polish. The more you learn. Anyway, these are the missiles we will check today, ordered by date. The idea is analyzing them in batches. First, a brief look at some specific variants, then a temporal overview, starting from the 60s, followed by the 70s, then the early 80s, and finally late 80s. These should be all of the most common active radar homing and semi-active radar homing missiles present in the game. Another advantage of splitting them into groups is that otherwise we wouldn't be able to see much, as 19 missiles in a single chart make more clutter than a pulse radar looking down. Besides, comparing missiles separated by decades makes sense only up to a certain point. For these charts I have collected 850 data points, most of them brand new. The scenario is the one we already know. 35,000 feet, co-alt, the target is static in the air, the various fighters are flying at Mach 1 out. So let's start with the AIM-7s. These are all the most common, spanning from the old single solid rocket motor powered E2 to the newer with dual thrust. We can see how the MHMP separate themselves from the M and F due to their ability to follow a lofting trajectory, whereas the F and M are quite similar missiles from the perspective of this video. Next, the AIM-54s. In this chart you can see all the versions compared and employ at a range shorter than 20 nautical miles, which affects their behavior and performance. The A versions are lighter, but there is fundamentally no difference at this range. We finally get to see something different, namely non-NATO missiles. These are grouped into two, the Soviets made and the French made. Since these charts are a bit cluttered, let's start by displaying only the French made missiles. Here we see a huge gap, era-wise, as we move from the 1962 R.530F to the 1979 S.530F, and eventually the 1988 Super 530D. The performance increased steadily across the decades. The successors will be the Mika, but it was introduced in 1996 and therefore well after the Cold War. These are the Soviets missiles instead. Unfortunately, there's a huge gap between the mid-60s and the 80s, caused by the lack of the R-23R, introduced in the early 70s. After a quick search, I found that the R-23R was created for a MiG-23's radar installed only on the MiG-23L and successors. Hopefully Ratsbam's MiG-23 will add that missile to the table to cover the gap left in the 70s. Away from that, the R-3R and the R-2US were a bit tricky to test, as the AI refused to launch them head-on, and especially in the case of the R-3R, the AI stubbornly refused to launch them further than a couple of miles. That being said, these are not considered bivouac missiles. The already mentioned R-23 and especially the upgraded R-24 should be the first Soviet missiles to be considered bivouac capable in a sense. In the 70s we only have the R-40 carried by the mighty MiG-25, a fighter that really deserves a high-fidelity implementation in DCS. Although way less common than the MiG-23, its role in the history of aviation is too important in my opinion. Fast forward a decade, we find the R-24R and the R-33. The former is a really odd missile. I gathered its data points twice, but it always looks the same, which is a bit odd indeed. The R-33 is instead a very capable missile carried by a really revolutionary aircraft for its era, the MiG-31 Foxhound. The R-27 is the standard missile of the 80s and 90s. The R version was much rarer and was not delivered abroad until at least 2004. This is good to know in case you plan missions against non-USSR threats. Performance-wise, nothing unexpected besides the odd envelope of the R-24R. Before moving on and segregating the missiles per era, let's have a look at how the R-24 compares to the AIM-7. As the story goes, the Soviets managed to acquire an M7E and they found it inferior to the R-24, so let's have a look at how they translate in DCS. As you can see, the R-24 is drastically better than the Sparrow E, even with that curious envelope. However, it is worth mentioning that the R-24 was introduced 12 years after the AIM-7E and 5 years after the AIM-7F. Let's now separate the missiles per era, starting from the 60s and earlier. There is not much to say about this period, as the heavy lifting was done by IR missiles. The AIM-7E2 seems to be having a jolly good time here, but in reality, we know how it performed. And these are the 70s. In this period we have the first real and functioning bivouac missiles. Besides the Phoenix doing Phoenix things, we notice the big gap left by the lack of R-23, which should have been employed by the 1971 MiG-23 and successors. This leaves the Soviet side, and remember that we are just talking about DCS here, with only the R-40 and the vastly outdated MiG-21's missiles. The French show up with the R.530F, a missile that shows very solid kinematic properties. Fast forward to the early 80s, this is my favorite period. The MiG-31 enters the field with its R-33, showing huge improvements over the MiG-25 and its R-40. We finally get the R-24, although as mentioned, the envelope looks quite odd, literally hitting the brakes the moment the rocket motor quits. In the late 80s, many things change. The R-27R joins the fray, a missile that quickly became the standard. On the US and NATO side, the AIM-7P shows remarkable improvements over every aspect, from ECM to CM resistance to guidance and trajectory. The Phoenix is still the Phoenix, but with the well-known improvements and a huge leap forward in terms of technology, something that will be later translated into the AIM-120 AMRAAM. Speaking of which, I wanted to include the AMRAAM, but we do not have the AIM-120A, and the first version available in DCS is the AIM-120B introduced in 1994. Back to the non-NATO side, the French Super R.530D replaces in our discussion the S-530F, powered by several upgrades and dual-thrust rocket motor, making it surprisingly fast. The last missile to appear in our list is the R-27ER. I have talked about it quite a few times already. However, I'm curious to know how many were produced and how available it was, since in DCS it is the go-to missile for the Red Force side. However, from what I read, and this was not the case, and I would like concrete information on the matter. If you know, please drop me a line in the comments below. And that's all for this video. Although very limited in scope, this review of the kinematic properties of the Cold War missiles in DCS should have given you a better understanding of what they can do, and how incredibly fast the technology has evolved in the few decades between the 60s and the 90s. Thanks for watching, and take care.